Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about the end of Poitiers campaigns and how it all ended. Stay tuned. So, before the start, please like a video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Any help on Patreon is highly appreciated. That would allow me to make videos more frequently. Thank you. So, at the night after the Battle of Poitiers, the Anglo-Gascon army set up the camp in the forest of La Nuit, east of a battlefield. The wagon train approached, tents were set up to the prince and his retinue. Edward invited John and his son and distinguished French prisoners to the dinner. Food was borrowed for the French stocks, since English has no provision at all. Well, gentlemen can fight each other, but they have no right to hate. The Black Prince assured the king that his father, Edward III, would treat him with a deep respect, although he would still consider him as an usurper. The next day the English started counting the dead French, many of whom had already been plundered by the locals. The bodies about of 150 aristocrats were taken away by the priest of Poitiers and buried in the Dominican church or in the Franciscan cemetery, while the rest remained until they were finally loaded onto the carts and thrown into the ditches near the church. It was time for Edward and his army to march back to the safe Aquitaine, and although the prince inflicted a stunning defeat on the French, he could not be sure that now he was no longer in danger. There was a large garrison at Poitiers. The city was too well fortified to surrender so quickly. Besides, the Dauphin was free, he could call his countrymen to arms. Again, the battle of the Duke of Orleans, although it fled from the field, did not suffer losses and possibly was somewhere nearby. If the French have a decent leader, they could block the road to Bordeaux and spoil the victory. It was necessary to act quickly, but in any case the movement was restrained by the wagon train, burdened with expensive weapons and dresses obtained after the battle. In addition, there was a huge crowd of prisoners, most of whom were on foot, so the chances of reaching Bordeaux without delay were slim. They decided to use the captured horses to transport their luggage and kept only the most important prisoners with them, who had previously been made to swear that they would pay the ransom before Christmas. The army of a Black Prince immediately moved to Bordeaux. It was necessary to cover a distance of 125 miles, but this is calculated in a straight line without taking into account the obstacles. On the day the English traveled about 14 miles and arrived at Bordeaux on October 2nd, 1356. Messengers were sent to England with good news for the king and the people, and ordered to declare victory from all lecterns and from the heights of the marketplaces. Along with this good news flew to England to Brittany, where Duke of Lancaster helped John de Montfort capture the cities loyal to the Charles of Blois. Charles was released from prison for a huge ransom, about 60,000 pounds, so that now he could not arm himself, and he only watched as Brittany gradually passed into the hands of English. Charles fled to Dauphin in Paris. Prince Edward decided to spend the winter in Bordeaux and wait for spring weather, which would allow the army to return safely to England. Some French aristocrats who promised a ransom for their release went bankrupt. However, even in this case, the money in English treasury increased because the chevauchée brought considerable income, and recover the campaign cost many times over. And a ransom was paid for the Archbishop of Sens, 8,000 pounds. King Edward bought a batch of nobles for 66,000 pounds and reimbursed the cost with interest. London was jubilant, but in Paris confusion quickly gave way to anger. The French army was defeated, the king was taken prisoner, the king's brother and son fled. The knights who managed to escape did not dare to show in Paris. Many could not return to their estates out of fear. They were afraid that they could be accused or even subjected to physical violence. Negotiation in Bordeaux began before John and his retinue moved to England. John agreed to almost anything to free him, while the Estates General, consisting of aristocrats, clergy and bourgeois, nominally headed by the Dauphin and trying to rule a kingdom that was falling apart before their eyes and did not see the return of the king as its first priority. They wanted to find a way to end the war. Among the options of estates considering the formation of an army large enough to expel the English, and offered to negotiate with them. King Edward was also in no hurry to free John. He saw the king as a usual means of reaching a permanent agreement. Edward sent secret instruction to Prince of Wales in Bordeaux to start negotiations but did not agree to anything other than temporarily and short truce, which in any case would exclude Normandy and Brittany. Meanwhile in Paris, Dauphin did not listen to advice of a States General. He tried to find money through a devaluation. This measure caused massive discontent. Moreover, at the Imperial Congress in Metz, the Dauphin did not receive any help from the pro-French Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and therefore his entourage had no choice but to return to the States to agree to their demands for a radical reform of administration. Among the announced measures were the dismissal and imprisonment of many of the Dauphin's and his father advisors, and the rejection of new devalued coins. The Dauphin was supposed to rule the country only after agreeing on this or that decision with the States. The Dauphin was obliged to declare new taxes in order to continue the war. There was no question of ransoming the king. The Dauphin agreed to all demands. What was left for him? What alternative could he offer, not having a single sou in the treasury? When this news reached Bordeaux, John decided to take everything into his own hands. He wrote and sent letters to Paris demanding to read them at all crossroads. In these letters, he stigmatized the new administration and condemned the collection of taxes. As a result, this led to more chaos and opposition from the Dauphin. Having entered a negotiation with the Prince of Wales, John achieved nothing except for a 2-year truce before Easter of 1359. In the spring, ships arrived from England and took the army home. On May 24, 1357, to the cheers of population, the Black Prince and his army entered London in triumph. John rode a handsome grey war horse, while the Black Prince rode a humble pony. This was done, of course, deliberately. It was necessary to show that the French, with all their pomp and foppishness, could not oppose anything to the force of English weapons. John was placed in Savoy Palace, built by Henry Lancaster with the money received from a ransom of French prisoners. There began a luxurious imprisonment of a French king, and in the meantime negotiations were underway for a ransom. Edward III liked the noble prisoners. He took him with him on a hunt and walked with him and the other prisoner King David II of Scotland, who by the time was serving his 11th year in the Tower. In June 1357, a French deputation arrived at Westminster for negotiations. It was necessary to decide on one condition the war should end. The delegation was headed by Cardinal Perigord, from the English regarded with great suspicion, and Cardinal Capozzi, an Italian by birth. The Italian was considered relatively impartial. Along with the cardinals came a host of lawyers, officials, advisors, and hangers-on, all with personal servants. They needed to be accommodated and fed. In parallel with negotiations, there was a discussion with the Scottish, who finally understood the hopelessness of unfriendly attacks on England, especially since their French allies found themselves in difficult position. At a meeting in Edinburgh, they agreed to pay a ransom of £67,000, a huge sum for an impoverished country with a small population and no sources. They agreed that the ransom will be paid for 10 years. During this time, the Scottish promised not to take up arms against England and provided hostages to ensure their good behavior. In October, David was brought to Berwick, where he was present at the signing of the agreement, after which the king was released. In his country, David now enjoyed little confidence and therefore could not intervene in the interfractional disputes. After long discussions and disputes, a draft treaty was conducted between England and France, approved in December 1357. According to this document, almost a third of the French territory, including Calais and its suburbs, was at the complete disposal of Edward III. The ransom for the French king was £650,000 sterling, 100,000 of which had to be paid immediately, after which John could be released on parole, provided that hostages were given for him. Edward, in return, renounced his claim to the French crown. In February 1358, the English Parliament met at Westminster to discuss the treaty. Members of the Parliament were in no hurry to make a decision. England protected itself from invasion, but very many wanted to continue the war. These were professional soldiers, officials who hoped to receive the conquered lands, ship owners hired by the government to transport soldiers, manufacturers of weapons and armor, craftsmen who made bows and arrows, and peasants who raised geese were also interested in the war. It was necessary to consult with Pope. Everyone knew that the pontiff wanted peace between England and France. The Pope levied taxes on the English clergy, which meant that the English money went to Avignon, to France. The high priests appointed to the English ecclesiastical post believed that such appointments were their affairs, not on the overseas foreigner. Such disagreement in less than 2 centuries would lead to the final break with the Roman Church. The embassy in Avignon meant that at least one bishop, lawyers, officials, and an escort had to go there, and therefore it would take a long time, and the armies will continue to pay, and arms manufacture will not be left out without a war. King Edward drew a line. Although he agreed to send emissaries to Avignon, the delegation should consist of 2 knights and 1 or 2 officials. This way they will solve the case faster. Meanwhile, John, who knew the terms of the treaty and understood that he would not meet with universal approval in France, sent a group of his advisors to explain the details of essence of the matter to the government and the people. The difficulty for John was that France was in a state of a civil war. The States General, trying to rule the country without a king, imposed increased taxes on the population, but after the death and captivity of so many nobles, order and discipline in the country went wrong and lawlessness grew. Demobilized soldiers and deserters, mostly English and Gascons, although French too, gathered in the free companies and worked for whoever was willing to pay them. If there were none, they simply occupied a suitable castle and captured a fortified city, declared themselves barons and collected tribute from each. The King of Navarre, imprisoned by John for plotting against him, escaped from prison and, appearing in Paris, persuaded the Dauphin to forgive him. The Parisian third class, the bourgeois, gained increasing influence, while the aristocrats defeated and humiliated at Poitiers lost their authority. The bourgeois leader, Etienne Marcel, a wealthy cloth merchant, planned to make Charles of Navarre king of France. He was, after all, from the Capetian dynasty. Navarrese would not have objected to claim the crown when the time came, but he was too smart to take it at the behest of a crowd and therefore hastily left Paris. In March 1338 the Dauphin followed him because he left, and not without reason, that the government of the country was so disorganized that even his life was in danger. This impression was confirmed when the men of Etienne Marcel broke into the palace and killed 2 high-born officials who lived there with Dauphin. The Parisians captured the capital. They opposed the treaty with England. Meanwhile, the nobles who owned the estates were forced to collect money for their own ransom. Some sought funds to rescue relatives from captivity, and the state demanded from them money for John. Wherefore the nobles put even more pressure on the peasants and were already tortured by taxes. In the end, the people's patience ran out. It all started in Beauvaisis, now Oise department. The peasants revolted and attacked their masters, armed with anything. It seems that everything happened spontaneously, but this uprising surpassed the ferocity of the French Revolution, which happened 4 centuries later. Unlike the Revolution, this uprising did not have a leader at first. The wrath of Jacquerie was directed mainly to the nobles, clergy, and estate owners. Murders and arson spread further. The peasant movement spread to Champagne and Picardy. Stories of atrocities committed there became more and more ominous. In rural France, unrest regularly broke out in the past, sometimes with casualties, but after a few days they usually subsided without causing much damage. These times, it seems, the peasants themselves were so dumbfounded by what they had done that they continued in the same manner. Moreover, they even began to receive some help from some town people and small nobles, and those presumably thought that in this case they would save their lives and property. Etienne Marcel tried to cooperate with the rebels, but this did not bring him anything good. When a deputation from Jacquerie tried to enlist the support of Charles of Navarre, the king used army, and many were killed. Edward III did not in any way support the Jacquerie. Could he approve the peasants who killed their masters, even if his masters were French? Nevertheless, the uprising played into his hand, and therefore Edward suggested that the French government quickly find a way to end the war, and so they could start putting things in order. The situation in France was terrible. 3 companies, Jacquerie, the King of Navarre, Dauphin, and the Parisians armed and ready for anything. Every day it became more and more obvious that Jacquerie is supposed to threat to established order, and then Charles of Navarre and the nobles, whose castles had not been captured, began to organize themselves. The peasant army could not resist them. Although the destruction was enormous, 80 castles and estates were destroyed between Soissons and Paris. By mid-June the uprising has been suppressed and retribution had begun. The vengeful nobles invented all the new ways to deal with the instigators. The uprising threatened the life of everyone, except of course the downtrodden peasantry. It was viewed as a betrayal of a crown, that is, the Dauphin. The Parisians began to turn their backs on their former leader, Etienne Marcel, because he, along with Charles of Navarre, plotted against the Dauphin, and led the army of Navarre, consisted mainly of English mercenaries, into the city. The crowd rose on the July 31st, with the name of Dauphin on their lips, killed Etienne and his chief assistants. On the 2nd of August, Dauphin rode into Paris, and Charles of Navarre withdrew his army from the camp of Saint-Denis, robbed the abbey and headed to Mantes to consider the next step. Despite the petition of John's advisors, the terms of a treaty approved at a meeting at Westminster were not accepted by the Dauphin. After the departure of Charles of Navarre and the suppression of a Paris uprising, confidence in the government and the Dauphin was restored. King Edward accepted the Dauphin's refusal and decided that another military campaign would bring the French to life. The English respectively put forward additional demands, including the claim to the French crown. An army of 10,000, according to John Chandos, but most likely were like 6,000 people, consisted of equal numbers of horsemen and archers, landed on Calais on October 28, 1358. The army passed through Artois and Champagne to Reims, plundering and destroying everything on its path as always. From December 1358 to January 1359, the army remained in Reims, in dire weather conditions. Having failed to take well-defended city, the army moved to Paris. In accordance with the newly established military tactics, King Edward tried to persuade the Dauphin to leave the city and attack it. He even sent Sir Walter Manny to the city walls to shout insults on the cowardly French, some of whom began to understand the unreasonableness of attacking the English army when it wanted to, and therefore the French prudently refused the offer.
I don't want to talk to you no more, you empty-headed animal food trough whopper! I fart in your general direction! What a strange person!
The only thing that even slightly consoled the French was the attack of New Chelsea in March 1360, where several French ships made their way to the coastal and disembarked soldiers, who burned the city, spent the night there and left again. The English paid for their complacency. Over 20 years there has not been such an attack on a country yet, and they did not experience the honor that they themselves led to the French for many years. King Edward moved towards Chartres, leaving the ashes behind him. The English thought they could do anything in France, sow death and destruction while bypassing fortified cities. This behavior revived the Dauphin and his advisors. In Bretigny, near Chartres, negotiation began, and a week later the agreement was signed. The terms were much the same as in December 1357 document, except for the ransom of John. The amount was reduced to £600,000. In October 1360 an agreement was signed in Calais. The Dauphin signed it for his father, and since King Edward returned to England the Black Prince signed for him. King Edward received Aquitaine, Poitiers and Calais, and full disposal and renounced claims for the French throne. 2/3 of the ransom for John was paid, thanks to increased taxes on salt, wine, textiles, most of the movable property, as well as thanks to the engagement of the 11-year-old daughter of John to a Duke of Milan. The king was allowed to return to France, leaving his 3 younger sons as hostages. When the Duke of Anjou, Jean, broke his word, left France and refused to return, John was forced to return to England, where he died in Savoy Palace in April 1364. The king was only 45 years old. The Black Prince, who became the Duke of Aquitaine, became the ruler of English France. Everything seems to be restored to everyone's satisfaction. Well, that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening and watching. Bye bye.